Okay, this is Unit 304, Effective Communication, Activity number 24. In this case, it's asking you, we can communicate in appropriate or inappropriate ways. And they are talking about a workplace situation. This is not hanging out with your friends. This is in the workplace. What examples of some of these? What are examples of some of these? So you're going to give some examples of different forms of communication. Now, there is non-verbal communication and verbal communication. We're just going to look at one at a time. Verbal communication. The examples you're going to give here, verbal communication is communicating with the mouth. So actually physically, well, not physically, well, yeah, physically actually talking to somebody. So there isn't that many forms of verbal communication apart from talking to someone. But then they also want you to tell us the difference between appropriate and inappropriate communication. So these are things you should do in this column, 2 things you should do, and 2 things you shouldn't do. So when all of these cases, when you're giving an example, think in terms of if you were telling somebody else the difference between right and wrong here. And it must be verbal communication. We'll look at that later. What I've done, there's only 4 boxes. So you're going to put 2 appropriate forms of communication and 2 inappropriate forms of communication. Hopefully the pictures will give you some clues, but I'll just quickly run through appropriate forms of verbal communication. This would be speaking clearly. Okay. It would be listening carefully. It could be being polite. Okay. Or I don't know. No, we're not going to use eye-to-eye contact. We'll save this for the other one. But being polite when you're talking to someone is an appropriate form of verbal communication. There's a few. You may be able to think of other ones, but it just needs 1 writing in that box and 1 writing in this box. Now to inappropriate forms of verbal communication, not any form of communication, but verbal communication. There's actually, you probably think of more yourself. Inappropriate forms of verbal communication includes, what do you think's happening there? Abusive language, swearing is inappropriate. What's happening here? Shouting at someone is inappropriate verbal communication. It's definitely verbal and it's definitely inappropriate. What's happening here? There's several things we could talk about here. One is jargon. Now, jargon is where somebody talks, uses special terms, and other people, obviously these people don't even understand the terms that they're using. So, for example, jargon, make sure you fill out the X1994Z form. So, inappropriate verbal communication is do not use jargon. Okay. The other thing is, I suppose you could put there with inappropriate verbal communication, you could see there, make sure you let the other person have a chance. Maybe they're doing all the talking and they're not allowed to do any talking. So make sure you give the other person a chance. Okay. So just make sure you stick to verbal communication. One example here of appropriate communication, and just write it in the boxes. Okay. It could be just a small phrase. Speak clearly. Okay. Then finally, at the end here, it's asking you, why is effective verbal communication important? Why is it important to communicate verbally? And I want you to put your own answer in here, but always start off your sentence, which will make it easier. Verbal communication is important because, and then just finish off that sentence however you feel it's important. That's it.